This week, we're sitting with Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, and it's about Peter's encounter with Jesus at the water. And I want to invite us to move slowly throughout this text, especially as we prepare to enter the Lenten season. Luke tells us that Jesus is teaching by the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowds are pressing in. And so Peter and the other fishermen, they're nearby, they're washing their nets after a long night of work. And we're told something important before Jesus ever speaks to Peter, that they've caught nothing. Did you hear what I said? I'm going to say that again. They caught nothing. Now, this is not a triumphant moment. When we think about it, when we dive deeper into context, it's an exhausted one, because Peter is not meeting Jesus from a place of strength. He's meeting him after failure, after effort, after disappointment. He's worked all night and the nets are empty. Now, I want you to see that's important because Peter is like a professional. I mean, he does this and the nets are empty. But watch this. Formation often begins there. Not when we're spiritually strong, not when we feel impressive, but when we become aware of our limits. And so Jesus, he steps into Peter's boat, not after Peter has proven himself, but while he is still sitting in the reality of what didn't work. And then Jesus, he says something. He tells Peter to put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Now, pause here, right? Again, Peter is a professional fisherman. He knows these waters. He knows the timing, right? He knows what time fish are caught. He knows the daytime is not ideal. He understands that the night has already proven unfruitful. And so he responds by saying, "Master, we've toiled, we've worked all night and we've caught nothing." Listen, this isn't sarcasm, right? Because sometimes we pin Peter, and it could be true, as, the hard one, the one who will cuss you out and the one who's bold and brazen. And so when he says, "Master, we've worked all night long and caught nothing," I promise you it's not sarcasm. What it is honesty. Here's another thing it is. It's fatigue speaking. It's experience speaking. It's realism speaking. And yet he adds 5 words that change everything. But if you say so. But if you say so. And that phrase, it's the hinge of the passage. But if you say so. It's not bold confidence. It's not emotional manipulation. It's obedience in certainty, right? And so Peter, he doesn't suddenly feel inspired. He does not receive a detailed explanation. He does not understand why this should work by now, but he simply trusts the one who is speaking. And as we enter Lent, that phrase matters, because Lent is not about proving our spiritual strength. It's about honest seeing. It's about allowing the light of Christ to reveal what is true, not only about God, but about us. And so after, he lets his net down, he listens to what Jesus says, he's obedient, they have this miraculous catch, right? So many fish come in the net that the nets begin to break. It cannot contain the miracle. And so after the miraculous catch, Peter falls at Jesus' knees and he says something that's so interesting, it's so striking. He says this, he says, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." What? Peter, what would prompt you to respond like that? Why would you say something like that? I want you to see that Jesus, he has not shamed him. He's not exposed him publicly, but in the presence of holiness, Peter suddenly becomes aware of himself in a new way. Here's something I want you to catch. Holiness reveals truth. When the nets overflow, Peter doesn't just see abundance. He sees contrast. He sees the difference between divine authority and his own limitation. So Lent, it does something similar. When we fast, when we remove things like, for me personally, bread, sugar, a distraction, noise, what begins to surface? Impatience, irritability, headaches, right? Things like fear, control, attachment, dependence on comfort. And so I want you to see that spiritual disciplines are not about punishment. They're about space. They create room for God to act in us and on us. They quiet the noise long enough for clarity to rise. And so Peter's boat becomes that space. And in that boat, Peter sees who Jesus is. And in that light, he sees himself more clearly. But here's what I love about this passage. Jesus does not affirm Peter's shame. What he does is he redirects his calling. He says, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people, right? So he took him from a fisherman to a fisher of men. He says, don't be afraid, Peter. You're going to be catching people. So what I want to draw from this is the awareness of sin is not the end of the story. What it is the doorway to vocation. In other words, honest self-recognition is not meant to paralyze us. It's meant to reorient us. So let me ask you gently this week. During your practice of fasting or whenever you begin to fast, I want you to pay attention to what surfaces. What will begin to surface? What has surfaced? Has God identified an old habit that needs to be replaced with a new one? Is there a spiritual discipline you have avoided that you are now being invited to lean into? Is God asking you to trust God in an area where you have grown cautious? Where is Jesus saying, hey, you, put out into the deep? And what would it look like for you to respond, not with certainty, but with surrender? But if you say so. And so Peter's obedience, it precedes the miracle. He lets down the nets before he sees the fish. And perhaps that's the invitation for us in this season. Not to wait until we feel ready, but to move in trust. So the passage ends with a simple but profound statement. When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. Notice the order. There is abundance, there is awareness, there is calling, and then there's surrender. So gratitude precedes departure. And this week in your prayer time, here's what I want you to do. Focus intentionally on Thanksgiving. Reflect on the gifts that you've received in this season. Reflect on the mercy that has sustained you. Reflect on the most precious gift that we all have received through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. How do we demonstrate gratitude for unmerited favor? Not by striving to earn it, but by trusting the one who gives it. And so Luke chapter 5 reminds us that Jesus still steps into tired boats, that Jesus still speaks into exhausted places, and that Jesus still calls us beyond what we think is possible. And so the question is not whether Jesus is speaking. The question is whether we are willing to let down our nets again, even when we're tired, even when we've tried before, even when we don't fully understand. Formation often sounds like this. But if you say so, and that is enough.